The bad idea I came up with is energy transition is enough, as I think it's an incredibly bad idea, and because I'm just befuddled by the basic unwillingness to engage. What did the UN Secretary General say about how bad climate change is? The era of global warming has ended. The era of global boiling has arrived. Climate change is here. It's terrifying, and it's just the beginning. And what does he have to say about food? Basically nothing. The FAO started measuring meat consumption in 1961. And if you include meat and seafood, they have hit a new global record every single year since 1961. For just land animal meat, there was a slight hit for BSE, there was a slight hit for African swine fever and COVID, but the line trajectory, it goes like this, and then it just picks right back up. Sergey Brin paid to develop the prototype burger back in August of 2013. It cost 250,000 euros. They have brought down the price in less than 13 years by a factor of 100,000. So they brought down the price by 99.999% because they're focusing on figuring out what are the scientific challenges, what are the price drivers, and let's fix them. It's still twice the cost of producing beef, which means 4 to 5 times or more the cost of producing chicken. But costs are plummeting with really not that many resources, certainly relative to something like energy transition. EVs got about $500 billion or more last year in investments. In all of time, cultivated meat has gotten about $3 billion. So the amount of progress that's been made in really not very much time is pretty remarkable.
Welcome to Saving the World from Bad Ideas. I'm Mark Lynas, and I've had a few bad ideas in my time. I used to go out in the nighttime to destroy GMO crops, and I also opposed nuclear power. But then when I looked at the science, I found I got it wrong. Oops! I've learned the hard way that none of us are right all the time. So now I'm here to challenge the assumptions that we all too often take for granted, because the future depends on us getting it right. Hello, my guest today is Bruce Friedrich, who's president and founder of the Good Food Institute, of which I'm a big fan of many years. And he's author of a new book called Meat, How the Next Agricultural Revolution Will Transform Humanity's Favorite Food and Our Future. Bruce, welcome.
Thanks so much, Mark. I'm delighted to be here. I really appreciate the invitation.
I'm delighted you could join us. Thank you so much. Now, we have to start with the bad idea that you're combating. And this took some thought for me, and let me just sort of pitch this to you, okay? Perhaps the bad idea is that everyone should give up meat or everyone should go vegan, because it's not a bad idea per se. I know you've been vegetarian since you were 18. My wife's been vegetarian since she was 17. But, in terms of dealing with the issues of industrial meat production, insisting that everyone goes vegan just isn't, in my view, and I think possibly in your view too, and maybe this is the case you're putting in the book, isn't going to work. So would that work as a bad idea that everyone should go vegan? I know it's a bit provocative, but...
I don't know. I think one of the things that everybody should go vegan does is it lights a fire under people, and it nets people like me and your wife, the founders of companies like Beyond Meat and Impossible Foods and Upside Foods and Wild Type. Like, maybe everybody should go vegan doesn't actually get you sufficient net vegans, but it's possible that the message and the certainty of the message, it gets you a bunch of vegans, and it gets you people who are motivated to try to change the system. The bad idea I came up with is energy transition is enough, both because I think it's an incredibly bad idea and because I'm just befuddled by the basic unwillingness to engage among so many people who will, what did the UN Secretary General say about how bad climate change is? The era of global warming has ended. The era of global boiling has arrived. Climate change is here. It's terrifying, and it's just the beginning. What does he have to say about food? Basically nothing. And that is pretty broadly true. And it's not they're engaging and ruling things out. They're just not engaging, even though 100% of the science, 100% of the models, whatever you think about, 2.0 and whether we should have targets, if continued warming is the problem that the climate community recognizes that it is, continuing to ignore the cause of 20% of it when there is such a tractable solution is pretty remarkable.
Interesting. I mean, that's ironic because we just published a paper in Nature, which we covered in last week's podcast, which says almost precisely the opposite to what you've just said, which is we were suggesting that actually we should focus on energy squarely at the moment, at least to deal with the CO2 problem. And maybe this is where the nuance comes in, because fossil fuels is 90% of anthropogenic CO2. And so if you can get rid of fossil fuels from the system through transitioning rapidly, and entirely to clean energy, then you've more or less knocked that problem on the head. But the argument, and I guess maybe this is where we can agree, the argument we make is that food and agriculture and deforestation, these things need a kind of more sectoral approach. I mean, there's specific problems with specific solutions, which I think you're proposing in this book, and lumping them all together with the kind of the broader energy transition and everything else into this CO2e basket, as they do, actually is unhelpful because it makes the problem too complex. I don't know whether you agree or not.
I think you would agree, Mark, that we can do more than one thing at the same time. And I'm guessing you would agree that however much progress we can make in decarbonizing energy, that gets you to about 55% of emissions. Even Michael Liebreich on your podcast was saying $100, $200 a ton for tech-based sequestration is going to be necessary to get us the rest of the way there. So if you've got something, I mean, maybe there's some plausible explanation for why the alternative proteins intervention doesn't work. I haven't heard it yet. It really isn't we are engaging and think this isn't going to work. It's we're not engaging because we're just going to focus on this one thing, which I find pretty remarkable from people who are engaging on things like CDR and who will say at $100, $200 a ton, that is going to be necessary, while not thinking about the much easier, I think, scientific and engineering challenge of figuring out how we create meat in factories. And even if what you're thinking about is fossil fuels, I mean, there's just the basic inefficiency of growing 9 calories of crops to get a calorie from chicken, or 40 to 100 calories of crops to get a calorie from beef. And then, yes, of course, methane at 80 times the warming over a 20-year period, nitrous oxide at 274 or something times the warming. Like, why not tackle those problems for a fraction of what is currently being put into clean hydrogen or CDR?
Well, I think Michael Liebreich would argue, and has argued on this podcast, that clean hydrogen is not worth putting. Well, it's worth putting $0 into, pretty much.
Yeah, no, I agree. But the broader climate community is not. I have learned an overwhelming amount from him and from his podcast, which is why it just continues to feel surprising to me that the exact arguments that he uses for energy transition apply to protein transition, and he would be a phenomenal ally. With really no extra time, effort, energy, just, not continuing to focus exclusively on energy transition.
Well, when we finish recording this, I'll email him and tell him that we were talking about him, because I'm sure he'll be delighted. But for now, I think maybe the strongest argument, and the one that I'm really persuaded by, is the land use argument. And this obviously intersects with climate, because if you're talking about, CDR, carbon dioxide removal, allowing reforestation and rewilding of all of these vanished ecosystems, which we've basically plowed up and replaced with cattle ranching, is a huge, huge part of the solution. So for me, that's actually the strongest argument. But there's various other ones that you also make in the book, which perhaps would be less familiar to listeners. I mean, everyone will know about the climate issues like that you just outlined, but also talk a bit more about the issue with antibiotic resistance and how misused antibiotics are in animal agriculture.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mark. I appreciate that. I mean, I do think it's worth pointing out. I mean, there have been a couple of analyses. So McKinsey did an analysis for Climate Works Foundation and the UK Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office. They found that alternative proteins at 50% would mitigate 5 gigatons of CO2. The International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis found 3.1 gigatons of mitigation, another 3.4 gigatons of sequestration potential from the spared land. So I think these figures are not well known in the climate community. I think people are not engaging to a significant degree. And I think that's largely because people have written off the idea of trying to convince people to consume less meat in the same way that most people recognize that people are not going to consume less energy. So we need renewable energy. They're not doing the cross application that they're doing on energy. The real focus of the book, though, is that China is leaning in on alternative proteins. Korea is leaning in. Japan is leaning in. Really good stuff happening in the UK, in the European Union. And 6 years ago, it was zero. And now it's hundreds of millions of dollars per year. That is not because of the climate benefits or the antimicrobial resistance benefits or the pandemic risk benefits or the global hunger benefits. And I walk through those benefits in the first 4 chapters of the book. It's for food self-sufficiency benefits and economic competitiveness. So one of the top national security think tanks in the world is the Center for Strategic and International Studies. They wrote a report a couple of years ago about alternative proteins, and they recommend that the U.S. government invest in alternative proteins for the same reasons and at a similar level of the investment in advanced chips for AI and the biopharma industry. And that has to do with food and water security. So the first choice, when I was thinking about somebody to write the foreword for the book, my first choice was Caitlin Welsh, who's a global food and water security expert. She served about 5 years in the Obama administration and then almost all of the first Trump administration at the Department of State and then the National Security Council. And she wrote the foreword, and it really is leaning in on the self-interested reasons for governments to fund a protein transition. And it is it aligns to the land use benefits that you just described. At 50% alternative proteins, you free up 650 million hectares of land. Like that's more than the entire Amazon rainforest. So that's really the focus. But yeah, antimicrobial resistance, we're going backward on solutions for antimicrobial resistance. Oftentimes you'll talk to somebody in Europe and they'll point out that Europe is making progress, but superbugs don't honor boundaries. So about 70% of medically relevant antibiotics are fed to farm animals. That number goes up every single year. It's one of the top 2 causes of antimicrobial resistance. The other is overprescription in human beings. That's also getting worse every single year. So moving in the direction of plant-based and cultivated meat could take antibiotics out of the food supply, literally eliminate the use of 70% of medically relevant antibiotics, which are going into farm animals, which is also a pretty big deal.
And why are antibiotics going to farm animals? Because I don't think that will be obvious to people.
Yeah, I think once you think about it a little bit, like if you're going to go on a course of antibiotics, it'll probably be 10 days at the outside, whereas farm animals are dosed with antibiotics for their entire lives. Soon after antibiotics were discovered, farmers realized that if they fed farm animals antibiotics, the animals would grow more quickly. And also, if you cram 50,000 chickens in a shed, death losses without antibiotics would be sky high and would destroy the profitability of cramming 50,000 chickens in a shed. Whereas if you dose them with prophylactic antibiotics, they can live through those conditions. So sort of a dual benefit. And it really is a global scourge. The medical community has been screaming about it in peer-reviewed literature literally since the 1950s. It's been a top priority for the World Health Organization since at least the late 1990s. And nevertheless, on both of the key causes, we just go backward.
And how serious a risk is the sort of zoonotic outbreak for future pandemics? Obviously, COVID probably came from bats, so far as we know, maybe through some intermediary species like civet cats or who knows what that was being sold in China. There's this issue of bird flu, obviously a big issue for poultry, but it's also now jumped the species barrier. I think it's been found in cattle now and occasionally in humans. So what kind of a risk is the continuation of this huge animal agriculture industry posing in terms of future pandemics?
Yeah, there was the United Nations Environment Program and the International Livestock Research Institute. In July of 2020, they released a report titled Preventing the Next Pandemic. They have 18 of the world's leading zoonotic disease specialists involved, and I think something like 60 peer reviewers who are also credited in the report. They list the 7 most likely causes of the next pandemic. The first one that they list is increased animal product consumption. Just simple, more animals means more possibility of a pandemic, of a zoonotic disease that jumps the species barrier. The second one that they list is industrial animal production. If you cram 50,000 chickens in a shed or hundreds of thousands of egg-laying hens in a shed, that creates the perfect conditions for a virus that will spread through all of the animals, combined with the fact that these are such genetically similar animals. So natural disease resistance is super low because of the genetic similarity. So they list seven causes, and the first two have to do with the meat production system. And meat just keeps going up. So both of these continue to get worse, and all seven of the things that they list are getting worse year by year by year. So alternative proteins are something that we could literally take from one of the top 2 out of 7 causes to not a cause at all with making meat from plants or cultivating meat from cells.
So let's just go back to the issue that we started with, which is the extent to which humans are hardwired to crave meat. I mean, just speaking personally, I've been vegan like 7 times, and I never last longer than about 3 months. I always fall off the wagon. My friends even joke that I'm vegan between meals because it seemed kind of pathetic, and I feel really spineless and weak-willed about it. But I think pretty much everyone, well, I don't know. You tell me, like, is this something which is widely shared by humans? Because obviously when people get richer in developing countries, the meat consumption rates just seem to go up. So literally everyone everywhere seems to want to carry on eating meat, despite all of the drawbacks, which are actually fairly well known. I mean, what's your take?
Yeah, I mean, that is all of chapter 5 of the book. We may wish it weren't so. I've been vegan for 39 years. I went vegan and didn't look back. And a lot of people...
How come it works? Sorry to interrupt, but how come it works for you then? Like, what's different between us? Like, do we have different biology, or do you just give up when you were early enough that you've basically forgotten how good meat tastes?
Well, I know now because I'm eating cultivated meat on a pretty regular basis. I really don't know. I mean, I don't know what is the difference between some people sticking with it and some people not. But what I do know, and I say in chapter 5, is if somebody doesn't understand the adverse consequences of meat production, it's because they don't want to understand the adverse consequences of meat production. The FAO started measuring meat consumption in 1961. And if you include meat and seafood, they have hit a new global record every single year since 1961 for just land animal meat. There was a slight hit for BSE. There was a slight hit for African swine fever and COVID. But the line trajectory goes like this, and then it just picks right back up. So as an intervention that's going to change the trajectory, it just seems fantastically unlikely that we're going to come up with some new strategy that allows us to change that trajectory. But what we can do, and what I argue in chapter 6 and 7, is we can make meat from plants, which is, not your parents' veggie burger. People are not going to pay more, and they're not going to sacrifice palatability. So you do need something that is indistinguishable or that satisfies the meat cravings. Like, you can go beyond indistinguishable, but until you get to indistinguishable, that should probably be the goal. And you can do that from plants. It's not easy, but you can do it. Meat is made up of fat, protein, minerals, and water. Plants have fats, proteins, minerals, and water. We can figure out how to make something that meat eaters cannot tell a difference. And because it is so much more efficient, as we scale, we can bring down the price and actually beat the price of industrial animal meat. So it's a science challenge, and you do need to focus on it, but we can do it. We believe we can do it. It hasn't been done, so maybe we can't. But I argue in the book that all signs are positive. And then on cultivated meat, just like you can take a seed or a cutting from a plant, bathe the seed or cutting in nutrients, and grow a whole plant, you can do that with a small amount of animal muscle or animal fat. And people are doing it. There are more than 100 companies doing it. There are probably 100 university labs doing it. 10 years ago right now, there was one. So it's happening. Governments are funding it. Lots of top scientists are focused on it. And I interviewed for the book, I interviewed, so GFI, the Good Food Institute, which is the organization I founded and run, We have about 240 staff around the world. The plurality of our staff are scientists. I polled our scientists and said, who should I talk to? Who are the world's experts? And then I reached out to them and said, do you think that we can get to plant-based and cultivated chicken that is indistinguishable from an eating experience and less expensive? And if so, what's it going to cost? What's it going to take, et cetera? And everybody pointed to first principles. And a lot of people said, even 5 years ago, we didn't know. 10 years ago, we certainly didn't know. All of the stuff that looked like it might have been a blocker is not a blocker. So, I dive into what needs to happen and what are the challenges. And there are blockers, there are challenges, but it certainly looks like all of them are surmountable.
Yeah, I'm really fascinated by the whole cultivated meat. I don't know whether we can call it a revolution yet, but the whole alt proteins issue. Particularly for seafood as well, actually, because I would love to have a situation where we could just stop all industrial fishing and let the oceans begin to recover from the damage that humanity's already done to ocean biodiversity. And I know there's some cultivated meat companies out there which are working on salmon, I believe, and on bluefin tuna. So the very high-end sushi and sashimi cuts that people really love and that do such a lot of damage in their production. So give me a sense where things are at in terms of, both price and taste and kind of comparability. Do we literally have cultured salmon and cultured tuna and cultured beef and chicken available on the market now, or are we still some way off?
There is cultured salmon, and there's, cultivated salmon is on the market, very expensive, but price coming down. I don't think there's beef. There is beef that has been approved by governments. I don't think anybody's selling it at the moment. And then Vow Foods in Australia is making a sort of duck foie gras-ish kind of thing that people like just as much as meat. So, back to my observation that it doesn't have to be absolutely identical, but it does need to satisfy what people love about meat. But we do have, we still have work to do. One thing I would point out though, Mosa Meat, which was founded by Mark Post, who is a tissue engineer and medical doctor. He was a professor of medicine at Harvard Medical School. Now he's a tissue engineering professor at the University of Maastricht. He's also the chief science officer of Mosa Meat. Sergey Brin paid for him to develop the prototype burger back in August of 2013. It cost 250,000 euros, so something like $300,000 for that one burger. They have brought down the price in less than 13 years by a factor of 100,000. So they brought down the price by 99.999% because they're focusing on figuring out what are the scientific challenges, what are the price drivers, and let's fix them. It's still twice the cost of producing beef, which means 4 to 5 times or more the cost of producing chicken. But costs are plummeting with really not that many resources, certainly relative to something like energy transition. EVs got about $500 billion or more last year in investments, I believe. In all of time, cultivated meat has gotten about $3 billion. And cultivated meat's investment has been spread across 100 companies. So the amount of progress that's been made in really not very much time and with not very much money, one EV battery factory is going to cost you $4 or $5 billion, is pretty remarkable.
Yeah, you mentioned actually in the book about the hype cycle of this, and it's something that all new technologies, new industries seem to have to go through, whether it's the .com crash, which didn't end the internet, by the way, and didn't end e-commerce. We've already had that, haven't we, for plant-based or alt proteins? Was it before COVID? There was all of these huge valuations for all these new companies, and then the whole sector seemed to collapse. Where are things kind of beginning to rebuild now?
Yeah, I think things are beginning to rebuild. And then, yes, I would just slap some numbers on your observation. The .com bubble, the NASDAQ lost more than 80% of its value. Most internet commerce companies went bankrupt. Amazon lost more than 95% of its value. It fell from $213 to less than $6. And the sort of expert commentary was ruthless. Who would ever want to buy pet supplies online? Of course, Pets.com failed. Pets.com's highest valuation was $400 million. Chewy, a pet supply company online, has a valuation of $13 billion. So more than 30 times pets.com's value. And Amazon is doing pretty well too, I think. So, and you can look at just so many different industries, everything from airplanes to automobiles to artificial ice to artificial intelligence. And obviously things that people who listen and watch this podcast are maybe especially familiar with, things like electric vehicles and solar and wind energy. Solar, 1954, Bell Labs, the front page of the New York Times, the solar will power the world momentarily, essentially. Flash forward to 2016, and the International Energy Agency, like the ultimate experts, this is something obviously that Michael talks a lot about, is predicting 50 gigawatts, I think, per year increases through 2040, but no uptick, just every year, 50 more gigawatts. So their 2040 projection, their 34-year projection was crushed in 8. Similar stories to be told about electric vehicles.
Yeah, I think with the IEA and renewables, it's not what they thought was going to happen, but what they wanted to happen, which was continued fossil fuels on the system. So I suspect that was not so much a bug as a feature. But and what's exciting about all of these technology sort of innovations is that it's like an S curve, right? You're still perhaps in the flat part of the S curve for old proteins and cultured meat. But when it goes up and you begin to get into the vertical, things transition very rapidly indeed. And, I think you're seeing this with EVs now, we're certainly seeing this with solar and batteries. And obviously it happened in the past with, the internal combustion engine, the car replacing horse transport. And you talk about some of these analogies in the book. Like, when do you think the S curve is going to really begin to accelerate in alt proteins?
Yeah, I think if you look at something like EVs or solar, 10 years ago, so 2016, I think they both hit about 1% penetration in the US and globally. They're probably a little higher in Europe, I'm not sure. They were ever so slightly higher in China, or at least EVs, or they hit 1% in 2015. And to your point, they went from, in 9 years, they went from 1% sales to 50% sales in China. They went from 1% sales to, I think it's 25 last year, percent sales in less than a decade. And that happened because, what the IEA wrote in 2015 about electric vehicles is people don't want them. They don't go far enough. They cost too much and there's no charging infrastructure. And obviously the solution is, fix those three things. 100% of polls, literally every single poll that exists of plant-based meat and cultivated meat, the people who tried it and stopped eating it say it's too expensive and it doesn't taste good enough. And the people who haven't tried it, why not? What's your what's the worry? I think it's going to taste bad and it's too expensive. So I think we can start to go up the S curve as the products get better and costs come down and people become more familiar with them. So for example, Impossible Foods and Beyond Meat and a few other companies have some excellent products. People can find them at nectar.org online. But you're still in a world where the vast majority of the products are designed for vegetarians and meat reducers, not designed to compete with animal meat. So that's their niche. That's been the niche forever, essentially, until Pat Brown and Ethan Brown challenged it. And again, 10 years ago right now, there was no Impossible Burger. There was no Beyond Burger. There wasn't a plant-based meat that was even trying to compete with animal meat on taste or price just 10 years ago. So we've made a lot of progress. I think we really shoot up the S curve when we get to price and taste parity. So just like solar competing on price, competing on consistency, integrating the grid. And when you talk about, what it's going to take to get to the 2065 vision, as long as, you are out competing electricity, you can get to that 55% of emissions that's attributable to electricity. But then what does it look like to deal with the hard to abate sectors? What does it look like to deal with land use change? What does it look like to deal with cattle methane? That becomes a lot harder. With plant-based and cultivated meat, things like fish sticks, burgers, all of the ground meats will probably, so we'll probably see, curves like this. Sorry for your, like this, because the tech challenges of making a pork chop or a steak are going to be significantly more difficult than making, chicken nuggets or burgers, but it all feels surmountable. It's just going to take time. It's going to take scale up. It's going to take science and engineering.
And it's going to take support as well, right? I don't want people to get the impression that you just have to sit back and leave it to the magic of the free market for this S-curve to accelerate. And again, you make this point in the book that most of the technologies that have now become ubiquitous in the modern world, including all the components of the iPhone and so on, were at some point invented or supported by the government, either by the Department of Defense or through publicly supported academia and so on. So tell me what needs to happen now in terms of support from government and from elsewhere to really push this transformation forward.
Yeah, I mean, GFI, our number one goal is building a maximally robust scientific ecosystem that is focused on these challenges. And the way that you do that is you put these challenges onto the agenda of governments as things that they should be helping to make happen, both through funding R&D and also through incentivizing private sector activity. Mariana Mazzucato, The Entrepreneurial State, as well as Derek Thompson and Ezra Klein, their newer book, Abundance, was the inspiration for, as well as just what's worked in renewable energy and electric vehicles. But chapters 9 and 10 of the book, I really lean in on the fact that all of these technologies have required government support. And maybe we can get there without government support, but it's going to take a heck of a lot longer. And it certainly warrants government support. So 7 years ago, there was none. Now there's hundreds of millions of dollars. It's moving in the right direction, but it absolutely requires more. And even something like electric vehicles, the electric vehicle batteries, both first iteration and second iteration, were developed by the Department of Energy in the United States. Similar stories to be told across all of the technology. Professor Mazzucato walks through the iPhone and how pretty much like everything in the iPhone was designed with government funding. So the sort of myth of laissez-faire, the world's most robust and profitable agricultural systems, biopharma systems, tech systems, all of the areas of the world that have, every most robust sort of economic sector, all of that comes because those are the governments that are incentivizing those technologies. I look at biopharma in the United States, and the average government subsidy for a new drug was north of $1 billion through the National Institutes of Health, the National Science Foundation, other funding agencies. That's going to be true basically everywhere. GFI Europe just released a report earlier this week that they worked with Systemic on. So Systemic did the analysis about both what it will require in Europe to create a robust alternative proteins ecosystem and also what the payback will be in terms of jobs and economic activity. And I believe it's at 10% alternative proteins. You get north of 100 billion euros of economic opportunity and support for north of 400,000 jobs. And then a couple of years ago, GFI Europe worked with Green Alliance on a report that looked at low alternative protein adoption and high alternative protein adoption. The latter was 2/3. And the 10 countries that they looked at got, if you amalgamate them, to food self-sufficiency. 8 of them were internally food self-sufficient. The 2 that weren't could import from the other 8 because they went to net exports. But they could also 4x the amount of regenerative agriculture, agroecology, and they could, with freed up land, sequester, I think it was about 250 million metric tons of carbon, which is basically the equivalent of all air travel in and out of Europe, if memory serves. So really big carbon sequestration and rewilding benefits for better forms of agriculture and food self-sufficiency, which is something that governments care about. I mean, that's why Korea, Japan, and China are investing in alternative proteins. It's really food self-sufficiency and economic benefits.
Well, I mean, one of the big roadblocks, though, is that the vested interests don't just go gently into that good night. I mean, they fight back with some force. We've seen this in Europe. Actually, producer Rob, who's on the call with us now, is leading We Planet's campaign against this ridiculous proposal to ban the use of the word burger and sausage and other so-called meaty terms for plant-based products, and that's led by a particular MEP with who's a sort of obviously in alliance with the farming lobby. So the politics here is complicated, isn't it? And there's quite a schizophrenic attitude, it seems, from the EU and probably other governments as well. And they want to support innovation. They want to develop a whole new sector, particularly as it promises food security and all these benefits you outlined. But at the same time, they're under pressure from the cattle ranchers in the US or the meat and livestock lobby in the EU to basically stop this in its tracks. So there's a lot of work for us at We Planet and you at GFI and others to do, I suppose, in trying to put some more wind in the sails of the alt protein side to try to fight back against some of these big blockers.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's true to a point. I think if you compare it to something like the fossil fuel lobby, there isn't the same level of organized opposition. So in the US, both the Meat Institute and the National Cattlemen's Beef Association, which are the two largest meat lobby groups, they are opposed to state bans on cultivated meat. For example, their free market principles are strong, and they see plant-based meat, well, certainly cultivated meat, to some degree plant-based meat, as alternative ways of making meat, and they're welcoming of that. That's less true of sort of farmer and rancher lobbies writ large. I do spend some time in Chapter 10 just pointing out that market penetration for plant-based and cultivated meat is low, such that whatever farmers and ranchers, it's hard to be a farmer or a rancher anywhere in the world. And the complaints that they have about their lives getting harder are real. Michael kind of nodded at some of this when he was talking about 1.5 and 2.0 and some of the policies that were supported that maybe were counterproductive to actual progress. And I think some of those hit farmers and ranchers particularly hard, in Europe in particular. What does it look like to ally with farmers and ranchers? And as we are moving forward with alternative proteins, ensure that part of that transition includes things like ramping up agroecology, keeping exports steady as we move toward farmers and ranchers producing for in-country consumption with less agricultural subsidies than exist now. We could create a system that centers farmers and ranchers and focuses on high value crops for plant-based meat, as well as inputs for cultivated meat, as well as tying it to an increase for the meat that's produced that's focused on agroecology, regenerative practices, et cetera. I mean, it's important to be honest about the fact that it does require more land and does create more emissions, but it is better for biodiversity. It is better for farm families. It's better for soil health. It's better for a lot of things, just not climate change. But climate change isn't 100% of the things that we should be caring about.
No, I mean, I can see it's. I'm generally a bit skeptical on the regenerative agroecology thing for precisely that reason. That it uses twice as much land, organic, roughly. And obviously, the numbers can be argued about, but it's definitely because it's less efficient. You're not using all of the industrial inputs. Of course, it sort of more or less stands to reason. But I can see that working if you spared so much land because you're taking a lot of livestock out of the system. Then I can see that sort of compartment actually coming into its own a bit more. So that does make a lot of sense. And I think it's important not to see farmers or the farming lobby as entirely monolithic. I mean, I think Cultivated, which was one of the farming sort of lobbies in Italy, was the ones who orchestrated the ban for that whole country on cultivated meat, and something similar happened in Hungary. But there are plenty of farmers in other countries in Europe who are actually quite excited about the potential of a whole new economic sector opening up. And maybe tell us a bit more about what those value chains might be, because obviously you've got feedstocks going into these products, right? You've got sugars that need to go into producing alternative proteins and fats or whatever. So it's not like you're decoupling the entire food system or protein system from the land or from farming in general. So what are the potential opportunities that farmers might find with this?
Yeah, I mean, I think further to your point, there are a lot of farmers who are enthusiastic about the new opportunities and are also enthusiastic, the sort of get big or get out started in the early 1970s in the United States with a guy named Earl Butz, who was Richard Nixon's Secretary of Agriculture. And get bigger, get out was, literally his mantra. And that has spread globally. And so we have seen farmer and rancher consolidation, fewer farmers and ranchers producing a much higher percentage of the food, and the average age of farmers and ranchers just getting higher and higher and higher. And it's tough to be a farmer or a rancher today. And honestly, nobody knows better what it looks like to degrade an ecosystem than the people who are working in that ecosystem on a daily basis. So we've been really heartened by things like the Royal Agricultural University in the UK did a sort of deep dive focus group based project focused on what does it look like to have a shift like this with everything from on-farm production of cultivated meat or mycoprotein from some of the stuff that's grown that isn't going to be eaten by human beings, which is pretty exciting and interesting. So sort of cottage industry-esque. I talk in the book about in developing economies, if you're looking at something like, our entire India strategy has to do with India doing for alternative proteins, what China has done for renewable energy and electric vehicles. And a part of that is producing mycoprotein and producing cultivated meat, everything from, small production, which would be sort of like your neighborhood pub, if the pub is actually brewing beer, up to, larger production as well. Even down to the Gates Foundation funded Nature's Fine, which is a mycoprotein company in Chicago. They funded them to do some research on essentially tabletop protein makers of mycoprotein, which is corn, Quorn, uses mycoprotein. Just insanely efficient, very high quality protein, much higher protein percentages even than meat, dairy, or eggs. And what does it look like to integrate that into farming? And then, yes, shifting farm production to food for human beings when just vast quantities of it is grown to be fed to animals, which is going to be a much cheaper commodity crop. What does it look like to shift in the direction of commodity crops? What does it look like to shift in the direction of fruits and vegetables, which are also more expensive? Like, what would it look like to align diets with the Eat Commission's recommendations and Eat Lancet 1 and Eat Lancet 2? All of these can be significant winners for the people who are currently producing chickens, pigs, and cows, who would still be producing chickens, pigs, and cows, but in a more agroecologically sustainable manner. And I do think, the place where I think the agroecology people get in trouble is when they start claiming things that the science doesn't indicate around things like soil sequestration, outweighing the ruminant methane emissions or whatever. But what does appear to be true is, especially if you're like working in agroforestry, if you're scaling down numbers, you can scale out and improve soil health. You can improve biodiversity and certainly improve farmer incomes. Like, there is a lot of good to it. And especially, with alternative proteins requiring so much less land and causing so many fewer emissions, it feels like a reasonable trade-off. You also, you don't need the antimicrobial drugs. If you're using a more diverse range of species, you don't have the same contribution to pandemic risk. Like, there are a lot of benefits.
I was interested to hear you mention India there. And, I think this is often a very sort of global north-centered conversation in that, the big innovations are happening, I don't know, in Singapore or Israel or the United States. What about Africa? What about South and East Asia? Africa's a very meaty place. I've spent a lot of time there. Everyone wants their chicken and their beef and everything else. And cattle are sort of a unit of wealth, actually. There was Africa climate director who I was with a couple of weeks ago, and he's got 40 cattle, and that's his family's wealth. So how does the alt proteins transition, revolution, whatever, look like from a global south perspective?
Yeah, there's sort of global south and global south, right? So for India and Brazil, which are both obviously in the global south, but they also have really excellent scientific and innovation ecosystems. They're two of the top 5 government funders of agriculture. We are really leaning in India, as I mentioned, like the strategy is essentially, can India become protein producer for the world? And we think the answer is yes. And again, when you think in terms of what is the government most interested in, the prime minister of India, Narendra Modi, his entire life mission, if you asked him to list what are the 10 things that are most important to you, like 1 through 7 are going to be India is a developed economy by 2047, the Indian centennial. And he's really leaning in on some stuff that's going to put India into competition with much wealthier countries. And it's just going to be really hard to ramp up that infrastructure. Here's an area where, much like China got in early on solar NEBs, India can get in early on mycoprotein production, cell culture media production, plant protein production. On the cell culture media production, more than 60% of global vaccines are manufactured in India. That's the same kind of infrastructure and expertise that you need for the media for cultivated meat. It's almost all happening in the state of Telangana, very near the city of Hyderabad. And we're in conversations with them about becoming producer to the world and bringing down the price of that meat even more. On the mycoprotein and plant protein, India also has more malnutrition than any other country in the world. Not the highest rates, but certainly the highest numbers. And a big part of that is that their feeding programs are focused on rice and wheat, which are both low in protein and have, the protein that they have is fairly, low in bioavailability. With mycoprotein or soy protein, either of which India has the raw materials to produce that volume, you'd be producing something that has the same bioavailability percentages and much higher protein content than even the animal products. So this could be a part of solving their stunting, wasting, malnutrition problem. Even as it ramped up, they became supplier to the world. The analysis in some place like Brazil is going to be similar. Looking at Southeast Asia, Thailand is going to be similar. And Thailand, they have CP Foods, which is like the 5th or 6th largest meat company in the world, and is already very enthusiastic about alternative proteins, plant-based and cultivated meat. They also have production capacity, not at India's level, but certainly significant. So it could be a part of feeding people in Thailand and also giving Thailand a new industry. I think they're focused on EV batteries at the moment, which is pretty high and another really sort of high competition industry to be focused on. Same sort of thing happening with Indonesia. The Indonesian government is trying to plug into the global energy transition, and that's going okay, but they could be on the ground floor of this. They also have a very forward-looking school lunch meals feeding program, similar to Indian feeding programs. So Indonesia could also be a supplier to the world, even as it's solving some of their internal problems and creating a very inexpensive way of producing high protein foods. And then Africa, it's similar, but just the African ecosystem is a lot harder, obviously. That's why Africa imports so much food, despite having significant productivity. They're both importing food and exporting food in ways that really present a conundrum. There is, I talk in the book about the Global Alliance for Improved Nutrition. Sarah LaHaye, when she was at 1 Acre, as you mentioned, in Africa, it really is how much meat can we eat. I think that's partly status. It's also just partly dense calories, high nutrition. And something like mycoprotein or plant protein does satisfy that need. And 1 Acre Fund has found that in ways that are pretty fascinating. And I tell a couple of those stories in the book. And then there's another organization called Essential, a guy named Grant Gordon, who's been in global development for his entire professional career. They're now based in Nigeria. They're operating in, I think, 4 African countries. And they're focused on mycoprotein production, again, to create high quality protein as inefficiently as possible. And then the other thing that they're really focused on is climate resilience. So Michael Kremer, the Nobel laureate in economics from the University of Chicago for his global development work, GFI worked with him, with his team at the University of Chicago, which was looking at, what are interventions that can mitigate emissions, offer climate resilience, and allow more hungry people to be fed. And one of the recommendations is alternative proteins on the basis of conversations with us, and conversations with Grant Gordon at Essential, really is a huge climate resilience intervention in addition to being a mitigation intervention and a food security intervention. Because you can produce mycoprotein 365 days a week, a year, 24 hours a day, no matter what the weather is. So crop losses, animal losses from drought or heat waves don't, to the same degree, adversely impact something like mycoprotein production. So that's another really powerful possibility in Africa.
I worry that Europe's going to find itself left behind again. I mean, Europe's current protein model is to import large amounts of feed from, Brazil and the United States, feed it to pigs and cattle in the EU, have to deal with all of the manure going into the rivers and so on. So it's completely protein insecure in that sense. And then when this new sector comes along, they seem to be mostly focused on saying no and putting huge regulatory roadblocks up. We were at Solar Foods. We Planet held co-hosted a alternative proteins festival actually in Finland in September last year, and we went to Solar Foods and they let us try some of their products. But of course, you can't actually buy them, and so Solar Foods told us that they'd been supported by the EU. They'd given them a couple of tens of millions of euros. I can't remember exactly what the figure was, but then when they sent their dossier saying, "Can we please sell it?" 6 years ago, they still haven't opened the email. I mean, it's just insane how difficult it is to actually bring any of these products to market in Europe. And so the prospect of this whole new industry doesn't seem to be enough to convince the politicians or whoever it is to make a more, a more innovation-friendly environment.
Yeah, I mean, we are chipping away. The GFI Europe team is chipping away at it, and I think they're making progress. So, Germany obviously remembers that they put $200 billion into, there is no, solar is now shooting up the S-curve. That does not happen without Germany's $200 billion solar incentive. And all of that production went to China, which obviously they're not thrilled about. So we were really heartened to see the Science Advisory Council to the German Ag Ministry put out I think it was 350-page alternative proteins report focused on how do we make sure that this industry is in Germany and the EU and doesn't dominate elsewhere. And China is ramping up on alternative proteins. If you look at the 20 most active patent applicants and assignees globally over the last 6 years, 8 of them are in China, 3 are in Korea, and 3 are in the US. 3 in Korea, 3 in the US, 3 in Israel, 8 in China. And in China, almost all of them are universities. So it's not private IP that's going to, it's not private that's going to be protected by IP, which is most of the rest of the world. So China is kind of the odds-on favorite on this as well. And if China starts producing, meat, dairy, and eggs significantly less expensively than Europe can, because they're shifting in the direction of doing it from plants and using, growing it in factories much more efficiently, that's going to leave Europe in the dust. I do think we're seeing in Switzerland and the UK significant ramping up and understanding of where sort of global competition for agriculture and economics and the promise of alternative proteins. And we're seeing it to some degree in the EU. It's just much harder to reconcile all of the member states when they disagree. But it's a pretty new argument. So it feels to me like things like the Systemic Report and the Green Alliance report looking at the opportunities for Europe economically, jobs, food security are the way to go. And I think we'll continue to see growing support and understanding, really for self-interested reasons. Not knock on wood, I hope so, because it certainly is the case that if you're looking globally, even the U.S., it was Donald Trump's National Science Foundation that gave the first major government grant in 15 years since the Netherlands did it in something like 2005. It was Donald Trump's FDA and USDA that rolled out the red carpet, said we don't need new regulations for cultivated meat. And so now there are more approvals in the US than I think the rest of the world combined. Trump in his first 90 days approved more cultivated meat products than Biden did in 4 years. And certainly, the Defense Department, Ag Department, they're not all in on it, but they are.
RFK Jr. probably isn't in. I mean, he's about as anti-science as it's possible to get on just about everything. I mean, surprise me. Maybe then, maybe that's not what's going on.
he hasn't taken a position. Nobody has been, no public figure has been more opposed to industrial animal farming than RFK. So the fact that it is a much more efficient way and much less polluting way, and also that something like cultivated meat is just a cleaner product. Like if what you're concerned about is ultra processed foods, and I know you did a show on this, so we don't need to dive into it, but if that's your concern, cultivated meat, the U.S. government has regulations that have safe levels of roughly 100 drugs, including things like ractopamine, penicillin, all kinds of things. When they measure antibiotic residues in meat, even organic meat, they find that a fifth of organic meat, which isn't supposed to use antibiotics, has measurable levels of antibiotics. Just from whatever it is that concerns you about ultra processed foods from a health standpoint gets better with cultivated meat. So I don't know what RFK thinks about it, but I think we could make a pretty strong case within the construct of stuff that matters to him.
And what does the environmental movement think about it? Because all the kind of grass-fed beef type, organic-y type people, I mean, it's all about things being natural, right? And as far as, so my hunch is that lab meat, pink slime, tech, eco-modernism, this is all terribly bad. But maybe that's not the case. I mean, is the environmental movement split on this, or do you find that they're largely supporting your position or against? I mean, what's your hunch so far?
I mean, the World Resources Institute is very supportive. The World Economic Forum, obviously not an explicitly environmental group, but even at like the height of their environmental consciousness, very supportive. Kind of early, WEF was early adopters. People like Bill Gates, very supportive. The real leaders, I think, have probably been the World Resources Institute has really been fantastic on this issue. There's an advisory called Climate Advisors. Now, the Bezos Earth Fund is all in funding centers around the world, including alternative proteins in their $100 million challenge for climate and nature. Of the first 25 starter grants, 9 of them were alternative proteins. Of the recent 8 or 9 grants, I think it was at $2 million each, 4 of them were alternative proteins. So there are some sort of smaller organizations like the Organic Consumer Association, which is also anti-vaccine in the U.S. So they're
the anti-GMO crowd as well, I guess, which they are as well.
Yeah, I mean, the jury's some anti-GMO people are not concerned as long as you're not using genetic modification in the production, but they're supportive of alternative proteins just because what they're replacing is, they're just such a huge advantage for air and water, everything. So they're supportive. But yeah, there is some, but at least in the US, it's the, sort of smallest and most niche groups. No major environmental organization that I can think of has expressed opposition, and a lot of them have expressed support, even if they're not leaning in as much as I wish they would.
We Planet have been working on this issue for a year or so. We've just secured a couple of major grants on it, so we'll be doing a lot more. And I don't think we don't get anything like the pushback that we get on GMOs or on nuclear or some of these more controversial things, which is encouraging. I mean, it's easier to, score at an open goal, I guess, than when you've got a lot more roadblocks in the way, to mix my metaphors. But just to finish up, I think it's good actually to because we get in very much in the weeds about all of this, but just to go back to the bigger picture here, I actually think we could be really optimistic about the future, about the 21st century with this technology and all of the new opportunities that there are. With clean energy, we can tackle the majority of the carbon dioxide problem. We know already how to do it, and the technologies are cheaper than fossil and are really upscaling really rapidly worldwide. So we're beginning to make a dent on that issue. And with this, you've got land use, and potentially you can reverse biodiversity loss and rewild huge areas of the planet, bring back disappearing rainforests. I mean, that's the other big global problem. And also, if we can stop destroying the oceans at the same time, so much the better. I guess, and you do this really, really effectively in the book, is to present that positive vision, to really get people enthusiastic about this is perhaps the way to really build the momentum that we need to really move this forward.
Yeah, I mean, in the book, I try to be both clear-eyed, say it's not self-executing, it's not going to happen automatically, but also to say all of the science appears to be positive. what we have done, and even the last 5 or 6 years, is really significant progress. And if we continue to lean in, if we continue on the trajectory of especially scientific and government support, super optimistic that we can make it happen. And then to really underline how critically important it is, because you look at something like livestock's long shadow from the UN Food and Agriculture Organization, that's now 20 years old. They released that in 2006. At the time, they said animal product production is one of the top 3 causes of every major environmental problem, from the smallest and most local to the largest and most global. They called out air and water pollution, soil depletion, climate change, deforestation, really all of it. And in the 20 years since, we went from 266 million metric tons of land animal meat to 40% more, another 104 million metric tons of land animal meat. All projections are we're going to do something like that again over the next 20 years. And if that happens, all of these problems get worse. Everything from antimicrobial resistance and pandemic risk to hunger and malnutrition, because of the inefficiency of cycling crops through animals drives up prices and for both land and food, which leads to hunger and malnutrition. That's chapter 1 of the book. But governments recognize the economic opportunity. They recognize the food security and food self-sufficiency opportunity. So if you flash back 10 years, there have been 4 peer-reviewed papers ever on cultivated meat. Last year, there were more than 160. Through the end of 2016, so 9 years ago, there were 10 patents ever. Now there are more than 1,000. If we'd been sitting here 10 years ago right now, there would have been no investments announced in cultivated meat ever. There was one for $125,000, but just one, the company that's now Upside Foods, could go on and on. So we have a long way to go. But for 10 years, we've also made quite a lot of progress. And the book tries to be both cautious and optimistic, and to challenge people who are looking to make a huge difference across these areas. This is one area where you can do that.
Well, that's why I wanted the bad idea to be just to go vegan. Producer Rob is going to kill me if I don't really nail this down and have something simple which fits on a little slide for an Instagram post or something. You're absolutely going to insist that we can't have that?
Well, I mean, I really do think I wouldn't be here. An awful lot of people at GFI wouldn't have joined GFI. I think most of these companies wouldn't exist. Even when I'm talking to scientists, tissue engineers, stem cell, mechanical engineers, et cetera, like a lot of people have aligned their vocation with their diet. And it was the moral urgency of the vegan call that got them interested. So will veganism change the upward trajectory? No. And maybe that's clickbaity, but I really do think energy transition is a much bigger deal. We really need the sort of global policy community, the multilaterals, like the UNEP, UN Environment Program, released a phenomenal report called "What's Cooking" on alternative proteins. But among multilaterals, that's it. Probably every climate or nature think tank on the planet has looked at CDR. And like IIASA, I think, is the only one that's looked at alternative proteins. So it seems to me like, the one that does more good and that is also the bigger bad, the worst idea is the idea that we can rest on our energy laurels and everything will be fine.
Well, producer Rob and I are going to have to sit down and think of a clickbaity way to summarize that, because we're all about clickbait here at Saving the World for Bad Ideas. But Bruce, I just want to thank you for sharing your time with us. Is the book out now? Can people get hold of it straight away?
Tuesday.
Tuesday being, I don't know when this is going out, probably in a week or so, but Tuesday being the beginning of February, right?
Yeah. I mean, I don't know if you want to go all the way to, the climate. The climate movement is extraordinarily... I did I guess I don't open the book, but like in the book, I talk about the Secretary General being so clear-eyed about energy transition and ignoring food transition. Like their goals, and he has that line, we're on a highway to hell with our foot on the accelerator. And everything he's advocating, like shifts our foot up a little bit, but keeps it on the accelerator. So the sort of global climate and deforestation communities are basically, their big complaint against the world is you're ignoring what is already a catastrophe and it's getting worse. And they're ignoring something that if they continue to ignore it, they can't solve their problems.
Well, they probably all like their meat. I'm sure the UNSG is the same as all the rest of us. So
See, but this allows them to have their meat.
absolutely, and that's why I think your book is so important, because it's the same for energy. No one stopped driving when the first IPCC report came out. They needed a new technology which provided the same benefits and the same services, and we need proteins which have the same taste profile and the same cost as meat. And I think we're making a lot of progress in that direction in your book, and you've just eloquently explained more about it on this show, for which I'm super grateful. We'll let you go, Bruce, but thanks again, and please, everyone, do purchase the book. It will be out when you are listening to this, and it's called Meat: How the Next Agricultural Revolution Will Transform Humanity's Favorite Food and Our Future, by Bruce Friedrich. Yes, holding it up right now. Thanks again, Bruce, and we'll reconnect with you soon.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Mark. I really enjoyed our conversation.
Thanks so much for listening to Saving the World from Bad Ideas, a We Planet podcast. We Planet's a movement of citizens and scientists dedicated to defending the science and solutions we need to save the world. Please do subscribe and share a nice review. It helps us spread the message. We'd also love to hear your feedback and suggestions at our email, podcast@weplanet.org. Please also join our podcast mailing list, and we'll let you know when a new episode drops. Just go to savingtheworldfrombadideas.org or weplanet.org/podcast right now. See you next time.